If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. For those who spend time outdoors or in the woods, what was your scariest encounter with a creepy person in the forest, and how did you escape? My friend and I were searching for the perfect camping spot for about a year. After trying out quite a few, we found one that seemed perfect. It was about a half-hour walk from any trail or road, on top of a large cliff over a river. We got camp set up and decided to scout out around the area. It was getting dark, so we started heading back, following the sound of the river to guide us when we spotted something. A shack. We stop and look at each other and decide we better investigate because it is pretty close to where we are going to be sleeping, and this is weird. We get closer and realize it is basically a teepee made from scraps of aluminum and other sheet metal and a tarp. There is an inflated air mattress inside, and wine and whiskey bottles everywhere. There was also porn and a lot of extremely weird objects that someone normally would not have out camping. This place is a couple hours from any town and, like I said, at least a half hour from any road or trail. There were no vehicles parked anywhere, even remotely close, because we would have seen them in our travels. We came to the conclusion that whoever had been here must have left, and they obviously did not want to be found. Then, on our way out, I noticed the campground was still smoldering. We got the duck out of there. We immediately packed up camp and blindly made our way back to the road. Duck that, I watched enough horror movies to know that us teenage white boys would not be waking up that morning. I used to work at a Boy Scout summer camp. Every week I had to take a big group of campers to a secluded spot for their wilderness survival badge, where they had to build a shelter out of sticks, leaves, etc. and sleep in it overnight. The spot was only about half-mile from the main camp, but we took them a circuitous route that made it seem really secluded. Anyways, on this one night all the campers had made their shelters, we had cooked dinner, and we were all just sitting around the campfire. It was getting late, maybe 11 o'clock, so I sent all the campers to their shelters for the night and started cleaning up the fire. That's when we heard in the distance what sounded like church bells. They were pretty faint, but myself and my fellow staffers could definitely hear them. They went on for about 30 minutes, ringing every 30 seconds or so. We were all a little creeped out, as there were no churches or towns within 20 miles of us. After the bells stopped, though, the singing started. It was too faint to hear the words, but it sounded like church choir music, but a lot of people, and a lot more enthusiastic. Also, it was almost midnight at this point. The singing went on for well over an hour, sometimes quieting down until we almost couldn't hear it, sometimes getting so loud we thought it was getting closer. All of the campers were super creeped out, but I lied to them, telling them there was a church service going on in camp and that there was nothing to be scared of. Eventually, at almost 1 a.m., the singing stopped. I found out a few days later that there had been a large KKK rally only a few miles away that night, and that's what we had heard. I grew up in a small Scottish village with around 100 people. The village has one shop, one pub, one park, a church, and a graveyard. Our house was even more remote, a 20-minute drive from the epicenter of village life. My weekly entertainment was my dad driving into the village every Saturday night to get shit-faced at the pub and me and my ADHD brother playing in the village forest down the road from this pub. Our dad would get us cans of Coke, which was the highlight, and we would run deep into this forest high on sugar, climbing trees, building huts, and just having a great time. We would stay out until it was pitch dark and eventually drag our dad out of the pub. He would never come and retrieve us like he would this time. One night, as we were playing deep in this forest, my leg got stuck in some deep, thick mud. It got jammed right up to my knee, and I couldn't pull it out, and neither could my big 8-year-old brother. I started to freak out and cry uncontrollably. I thought that was the end of me. I thought I would sink deep into the mud and never be found again. My tears freaked my brother out even more, so he ran back to the pub to get our old man. At this point, it was starting to get dark quite fast, and I was still alone with my leg stuck. We were more deep into this forest than usual, so I knew I was going to be alone for a good 15 to 20 minutes. Not a great situation to be in, I thought. As I was crying and waiting, in the corner of my eye, I saw someone run towards me. It wasn't from the direction of the pub but from deep within the forest. I couldn't make out any major details initially, and the person was blurred. I was hoping my dad would turn up at this point and this new person would promptly stop running towards me, but nope. The person got closer to my field of vision, and I could make out more details. She was a girl and looked sort of around my age, 6 years old. I knew there was something strange about her though because she was wearing a dark grey 1800s Victorian dress, and I was certain now that she was running straight towards me, getting closer with every step. She came up to within 2 meters of me and stopped. My damn leg is still stuck in the mud. Her eyes locked onto mine. I said hello. No reply, no smile. Just stared deep into my eyes. "What's your name?" I asked her. Still no reply. Still, her black eyes locked. I didn't think she was a ghost or anything. She just dead-eyed stared at me for a very long time. She moved a little closer, not breaking eye contact. Time moved fast, and she simply turned around and sprinted back into the dark woods. Almost immediately after she ran off, my shit-faced dad stumbled into the forest, mumbling and swearing under his breath, with my brother following behind. I knew every single kid in that village and had never seen her before. The direction she came from and ran back into was just trees for miles, and nobody lived there. Her clothing was so weird compared to anything else I had ever seen. That forest was not the kind of place little girls would be running around, let alone late into the night. I definitely wouldn't have played in there at night if I didn't have my big brother. I never saw her again in the village or in the forest, but would have loved to know who she was. She was definitely human, in my opinion, just a very strange human who was drawn towards my loud crying and distress. I was about 8 or 9 years old when this happened. I grew up in a small town in Norway, so stuff like this happening didn't really concern me that much, considering this was a very safe place to grow up. Anyways, my brother played for our local soccer team with his classmates, and they were going away for like 2 days to a tournament of some sort, and they had to be accompanied by their parents because he is just 4 years older than me, and they were too young to be sent alone. Nobody could take care of me that weekend, so I had to come along with them all, and quite frankly, I wanted to, because this was a quite big city, and considering I was used to the rural town area, this could be a great experience for me. So on one of the days while we stayed there, I got bored of watching the soccer matches and got my parents' approval to explore the surrounding area, as long as I didn't stray too far away. I got my friend, 1 year younger than me, to come with me, and we eventually stumbled upon a secluded track field, surrounded by woods. After some walking, we found a mattress, the kind that is used to cushion the fall after jumping over a stick. I didn't find the right word to translate, so I tried to describe it the best way I could, lying at the edge of the field, really close to the dense forest surrounding it. We started just jumping around on the mattress, having fun, while all of a sudden this creepy older dude, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, sits down on the mattress and stares at us. He starts asking us our name, what we were doing there, and if we could show him our skills. I remember I obliged to his request of us showing him some tricks, but I was feeling quite scared at the time because somehow in my mind I was just convinced he was an alcoholic. A few minutes go by, and he asks us if we would be so kind and go and retrieve his crutch that he had stashed somewhere behind a building. He pointed at a building like 500 meters away, which looked to be abandoned. I answered him that we could, and we started walking towards where he had pointed. As me and my friend walked, I silently whispered in my friend's ear that he was an alcoholic and that we should probably run to our parents. My friend didn't understand the big deal, so I had to argue with him to get with me. Finally he obliged, and when we saw we had a good distance from the man, we ran as fast as we could towards the same way we came from earlier. All I could hear in the background was the man shouting, "Hey! Get back over here!" I didn't turn to look once and didn't stop running until I saw my parents. I have no idea what he was planning to do, but I know for a fact that he didn't have any good intentions. I think I told my parents what happened, but I guess they brushed it off because I was quite the paranoid kid, and they just assumed I had exaggerated. There have been plenty of creepy cases in the east of Norway, which is where this took place, but I cannot remember his face, so I wouldn't be able to recognize him in any picture. I was hiking along the north shore of Lake Superior in Minnesota. If you've never been, it's really thick old growth forest. There's a 360-mile hiking trail from Duluth to the Canadian border, really well-developed campsites, and enough traffic that I wouldn't feel unsafe on it anywhere. For this particular trip, we, my hiking buddy and I, wanted to turn it into a loop instead of an out and back on the same trail. We mapped out a section that's connected with some back roads and a snowmobile trail that would work as our loop. As we're hiking on one of the dirt roads, we see a random dirt biker approach us, stop maybe 100 yards back, and stare for a while. Kinda unnerving with him just staring at us for a while, but he eventually turned and left. We eventually get to a log shelter on the snowmobile trail that we plan to use as campsite 1. Nice relaxing campsite, go to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night, full moon, and I swore there were 2 moonlit silhouettes standing on either side of my tent. I'm not sure if this was a dream or a real occurrence, but it was quite surreal. I remember trying to remain as still and silent as possible for as long as possible. My first overnight backpacking trip with a friend, we're both women. I parked my car at a trailhead, loaded my gear into my friend's van, and we headed to another trailhead to sort our stuff, sleep in the van, and get an early start the next morning. This trailhead is very popular, just off a main highway. Plan was to then backpack through a pass back to my car. It's starting to get dark, and we have everything pulled out, and the last people are coming down to their cars. It's dark now, and there were a couple of cars left in the lot. Then I noticed two older men hanging around. They did not look like hikers and were not acting like hikers. They would talk to each other, but at an oddly far distance from one another and were facing us, not each other. Every time I looked in their direction, they were standing in a different spot, watching us. I instantly felt danger, like electricity buzzing on my skin. My friend was oblivious, rationing food or something. Next thing they started talking to her, asking strange questions and making comments about a big party and wondering if the trailhead gets chained at a certain time. I don't know, as I'm writing this, it sounds innocuous, but the dudes were creepy and fanned out in a strange way. I felt hunted. My friend, without saying a word, started throwing our gear back in the van. We hauled asses and messed up our packing. I held my knife and tried to shine my headlamp on it in their direction as much as possible, truly ready to fight or flight. Dude stood there and didn't back away. We drove off before I even had a chance to close my door. I've never been so angry. It sucks to live in a world in which you must fear for one's safety. A few years ago, we went camping at Yellowstone/Grand Tetons. He set up our camper at an actual site and decided to do some 2-day-long backpack trips in some of the longer trails. The second place we visited was Cascade Valley Canyon. Absolutely beautiful. So get about 10 miles into the 22-mile loop and decide to set up our tent here since it was getting dark. We cook some food and chill for a bit before heading to bed. Around 2 a.m., we're all awakened by something just outside the tent. My mind immediately jumps to bears or wolves or something. Then it starts talking. I will never forget it. I think there's 3 or 4 in the tent. Let's just get out of here. None of us could sleep the rest of the night. At the crack of dawn, we hightail it out of there. Made excellent time. Hiked the 12 miles in about 3 hours and got to ranger station. Reported what happened. They said they had received a call similar to our story in the middle of the night. They sent rangers into the trail at dawn. Never found out what was going down. I didn't hear of anyone getting hurt, but then again, I didn't really look into it. I was staying in a cabin in the middle of the mountains in eastern Tennessee alone as part of a solo hiking/camping getaway. Also, to preface the story, let me add that this cabin did not have window curtains on any windows, and the front door had a glass window as part of the door. My first night at the cabin went as usual. I ate dinner and then laid down on the couch to relax, and eventually fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I jolted awake when I heard 3 incredibly loud thump sounds, which I immediately thought were footsteps inside the cabin on the hardwood floors. I looked around the interior of the cabin from the couch and didn't see anyone, and I also didn't hear any strange noises. I always have my handgun on me when I go alone to the way backcountry areas of the mountains because, let's be honest, you never really know what's going to happen, and since I was able to have driven to the cabin, the extra weight of my gun was no issue. I also had been sleeping with my handgun right next to me in its holster. I grabbed it and looked outside all the windows and didn't see anything, so I laid back down. I didn't hear anything else out of the ordinary the rest of the night. I didn't hear anything unusual. The next morning, after I had woken up and eaten breakfast, I was getting ready to leave the cabin for a hike, so I grabbed all my gear and locked up. As I went to walk down the 3 steps to the ground, I noticed that each step was a bit loose and would make a loud stomping sound as you took each step. I immediately froze, and I recognized the sound from the stairs as well as the 3 loud thumps I heard during the night. Instead of leaving the cabin at that moment, I went ahead and drew my gun and cleared the outside area surrounding the cabin, and then I also went back inside and cleared each room of the cabin to make sure there was nothing weird inside or outside the cabin. I mostly did that just for my own personal sanity reasons after I correlated the sounds during the night to the sounds of the stairs as you walk on them. Let's just say I returned to the cabin well before dark that day and took blankets from around the house and hung them up over all the windows that night for some extra privacy and also slept, more like laid there waiting to hear that noise from the steps, on the couch again. Nothing strange happened after the initial incident. Honestly, I don't know what happened/who or what walked on the steps or made the noises, but damn, was I happy to leave the cabin after that? My friends and I used to hike and camp up by the French River in northern Ontario. For anyone unfamiliar with this area, it is extremely remote. You have to leave your car and canoe for a few hours, then carry your canoe to your campsite. On this occasion, we were camping for 10 days. There were 4 of us, and we didn't see another person or any signs of anyone else near us. On day 3, we decided to wake up early and hike along the river going north. One of my friends was really good with maps and planning hikes for us, and he said that this one is about a 9-hour hike, there and back to our campsite. We started our hike at 6 a.m. and around noon stopped to swim for a bit in the river to cool off, followed by some lunch that we packed and a beer or two each. We started packing up again and noticed a small cabin off in the distance, about 25 meters downstream. We knew we would come back this same direction, and we put our garage in a bag with our beer cans and hoisted it up over a tree. This is a common thing to do while camping as it keeps wildlife such as bears away from getting into your garbage. We knew we would be back this same way in a few hours to collect our garbage to bring back to our main campsite. For the remainder of the hike, I couldn't help but feel like someone was watching us. However, there were no other indications of people around us. When we reached the end point, nearly exhausted but also satisfied with how far we had come, we debated stopping again for a rest before making the 6-hour walk back to our main campsite. As we discussed, I mentioned that I kind of just want to get back to our campsite because I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. 2 of my 3 friends then also admitted they had a similar feeling, so we decided to head back. As we approached the area where we rested and swam earlier, we came across our garbage bag. It had been removed from the tree and left empty. The weird thing was that it wasn't ripped or torn as you might expect from an animal. Instead, it was untied and neatly emptied and left wide open on the ground. We remembered the old cabin downstream, but there was no sign of it this time. As we walked a little further, we saw something on top of a rock. It was our beer cans. We consumed 2 each, so there were 8 empty beer cans. Only they weren't just scattered on the rock as you might expect from an animal. They were neatly piled in a pyramid-type shape. As we got closer, we realized to the cans, we noticed a Polaroid photo tucked under the bottom one. It was a photo of 4 of us swimming. Completely freaked out at this point, we half ran and half walked back to our campsite. We arrived at dusk and decided that this night would be the last night of our originally planned 10-day camping trip. None of us slept a wink that night. We stayed up by the fire, terrified and hoping for morning to come. By sunrise, we packed up and hiked out with our canoes. We were so happy to see our vehicles where we left them and drove home together in silence. This happened a couple of summers ago as my boyfriend and I were driving home along a remote Forest Service road in British Columbia, Canada, returning from a camping trip. We're pretty familiar with the area we were in, having camped there several times before. Typically the only people we encounter out there, a good 70 kilometers from paved roads, are fellow campers in off-road vehicles or logging truckers on the job. This particular day was beautiful, sunny, and warm, mid-June. We were bumping down the road at a good clip when we saw a man come out of the bush and begin frantically waving at us. Very odd. We slowed down and came to a stop, with my boyfriend rolling down the window to see what this guy had to say. I was in the passenger seat, and as soon as we slowed down, I picked up a weird vibe. He was wearing a blue plaid construction worker's flannel coat, much too heavy for the warm weather, with khaki pants and work boots, and was clean-shaven with messy gray-brown hair, pale skin, and large glasses. He was maybe about 50 years old. Let me stress how unusual it is to run into somebody way out there without a vehicle. The guy was fairly soft-spoken and calmly, almost robotically, told us that his car battery is dead. He asked us for a jump. Okay, sure. We believe in road karma and always want to help out people in trouble when we're out in the bush. But where is the car? He tells us that he's been fishing all day and has been playing his radio, and it caused his battery to die. His car is down a very overgrown side road a little further up the main road. He walks ahead while we slowly follow behind him in our truck. Both my boyfriend and I are a bit weirded out, and we joke around to each other as we're following him that we hope he's not luring us into the bush to kill us. Except I legit felt on edge, and the joke didn't seem that funny. We followed him about 150 meters down the overgrown side road into a small, heavily treed area just wide enough for about 4 cars to park side by side. We never would have noticed this road if it hadn't been pointed out to us, because bushes had nearly covered the entrance. Anyway, sure enough, there is a car there, an older model, beige Chevy that looks very unsuited to the rough logging roads. The trunk is open for some reason, and a blanket is draped over it. The hood was already popped on the car, so my boyfriend got out, grabbed our jumper cables from the back seat of our truck, and began affixing the cables to the car. Meanwhile, I swung my leg over the center console and slid into the driver's seat. I felt very uneasy and looked around the cab for anything that could be a weapon, all while telling myself I was being silly. But nonetheless, I wanted to be ready to act if something threatening happened. The guy chatted with my boyfriend jovially, telling him about his buddy who he was fishing with but who went on ahead without him, but his friendliness seemed forced. He stood back, allowing my boyfriend to do everything, lingering behind him watching while he got the car batteries hooked up. There was an awkward pause, and my boyfriend had to prompt the guy to get into his car and crank it over. Throughout this, I sat in the driver's seat watching, feeling tense. The car fired up easily, and the guy got back out of his driver's seat. He said, "Thank you," in an oddly intense way. My boyfriend removed the cables and hopped into the passenger seat without bothering to put the cables away properly, and the moment the passenger door closed, I was reversing back down the narrow side road with branches scraping across both sides of our car. We got onto the main road within moments and went on our way. My boyfriend told me that the guy watched us the entire time as I backed down the road. It could have been just a socially awkward guy with a legitimately dead battery. But I can't help but feel this guy's intentions were more sinister, and that the fact that I stayed vigilant in the car and that my boyfriend was efficiently competent with the jumper cables helped us dodge a bullet. Not sure if the battery really was dead. But neither of us remember seeing any fishing gear. When I was a kid, I went to a summer camp that would take older campers, 12 to 14, on excursions like a canoe trip and or a hike for about a week at a time. It was located in Massachusetts, so we did a lot of hiking along the Appalachian Trail. On one hike, there was a group of about 7 girls and 2 counselors, 19/20. I'll never forget, one morning we are hiking along the trail and run into a random guy who is alone, sleeping stark naked in the middle of the trail. Now, you can't camp on the trail on the everyone who hikes knows that. You've got to camp in designated areas. This guy clearly didn't get the memo, so we carefully sidestep him and continue on our way. About 12 miles later, we get to our site for the night, and this dude is already there. Weird, considering we didn't see anyone pass us throughout the day. The whole night, he's real friendly, telling us things like, "My father owns these woods." "Oh yeah? Yeah, he's your father, too." Weird shit. At one point, one of our counselors mentions that the site axe is missing. It was there when we arrived, and when she went to use it for firewood, it was gone. The guy had a knife collection he was keen on sharing with us, so it was pretty clear he was the one who took the axe. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, he was gone. Terrifying. I'm a geophysicist, and I go out to do survey work about 1/3 of the time. A lot of our surveys are in remote locations. I was doing one in my home province of Saskatchewan, very far north, about a 6-hour drive from the nearest small town, and then a 45-minute helicopter ride into our camp. It's isolated, and this survey began in October of last year, so it's quite dark a lot of the time. My room was in the attic of our only building, and the wood-burning stove that heated the place was directly below my room, so I often had to leave the window open at night. One night I had the window open and I could hear singing from outside, which was creepy, but I figured it was just a member of the crew who couldn't sleep. The next night I hear the same thing at the same time, about 3 a.m., and this time I get up to go to the bathroom. Everyone else was sleeping in cots in a large open room, and when I'm heading back to my room, I realize that everyone is in their cots. I don't hear the singing again for a few days, and it stops creeping me out. Until about a week later, I wake up and hear it. I go to check, and once again everyone is in their cots. I put my huge winter jacket on. I head outside and walk towards the sound. I step right up to the shore of the lake that we're on, and I hear it coming from somewhere across the lake. The moon is up and very bright, and I see somebody in the lake, which is absolutely freezing, as in it has started to ice over. At this point I am terrified, but I call out in case they need help. They dive down under the water, and I don't see them ever again or hear the singing. It feels like a dream to this day. What the duck? This memory is over 20 years old and super foggy because I was super little, but here goes. We used to camp at this same spot every year, until we moved. Anyway, this one summer, I remember when we were first pitching our tent, the nearest campers came over to say hello and pass on some advice that had been spreading across the campground. Something about bears and how everyone should haul their food up in the trees or something. I remember the guy offering my dad some spare rope, if he needed any. All seemed fine and dandy. Mom was antsy, but Dad assured her a bear wouldn't come into a campground this busy. On night 2 or 3, everyone was woken to a crash and the sounds of a car alarm. I remember pressing my hand over my sister's mouth because I was afraid that if she cried, the bear would come over. Or something silly like that. There was some distant shouting, and my dad decided to investigate. So he grabbed the tiny little skillet and his equally dis-sized, but in the opposite proportions, flashlight and exited the tent. I remember rolling over because there was this little tear I'd discovered the last time it rained. There were a lot of flashlights and people over by the bathroom, where a car's lights were flashing. It wasn't a bear that had been breaking into people's cars and stealing shit all summer. It was a crazy homeless guy who'd been hiding in the woods. They were actually pretty sure he was the same guy who'd tried to attack 2 teenage girls at one of the nearby hiking trails a few weeks prior, leading to it being closed for the time being. Spent a summer doing conservation work out in the absolute middle of nowhere in Wyoming. Was part of a crew that would spend 2 weeks camping in remote places to do manual labor in places machines couldn't get to. For this story, we were building new hiking/biking trails in the back portion of a designated wilderness area in a high-altitude desert. This means that the nearest civilization was a 2-hour car ride to a town of 41 people in a sandy soil area where tracks last forever. It was the middle of our stint during the early part of the night where everyone else had gone to bed, but I stayed up to read, so maybe 11:30 or so. Still pitch black outside, clouds had covered stars. So my headlamp was probably the only light on in a 40-mile radius. Suddenly I hear footsteps walking around our camp and head towards the tents from where I was in the community tent. That sound immediately put me on edge as I felt the hair on my arms raise and my adrenaline spike. I recall thinking to myself that 2 things are very wrong since the person was not using a light to see and the footsteps were not coming towards me from the tents, rather, it was the opposite. Within the 4 seconds it took me to drop my book, get up, and turn the corner of the tent to cast my light on the sleeping tents, the sound had stopped, but I saw tracks in dirt before me. It looked like they came from one end of camp, looked into my tent, walked through the sleeping tents, and kept going out of camp again. I don't know if I was making too much noise or not walking around, but the rest of my crew ended up waking up and asking me what was going on inside their tents. After explaining what I found, they all got up to look at the boot prints in the dirt. They were damn near perfect copies of my own boots except for one small thing. I had a rock stuck in my treads that messed up the symmetry. I was wearing fairly common work boots, except I also happened to wear US size 15 double-wide boots, so there was no way in hell this was one of the other crew members. I don't think any of us slept much that night. After that night, we didn't witness or hear anything else. A light rain removed the tracks a couple days later, but I do remember none of us were willing to step on the prints themselves and instead chose to step over them like cracks in the sidewalk. I used to do salmon spawning surveys, which involved walking up streams looking for fish. Some of the streams are quite remote and or inaccessible on timber land, and you don't really expect to see any other person when you're out there. As a naturally smiley, friendly, small feminine woman, I've learned to be wary of people 100% of the time in the field. I actively try to avoid running into people when I'm alone in remote places. One of the survey locations is close to a highway. To get to it, I had to park at a pullout, follow a river downstream to a flagged trail, and hike over a ridge to meet up with an old logging road on private timber land. I walked along the logging road for about 100 meters before peeling off into the woods, very thick second-growth Douglas fir reprod, where game trails eventually lead to the stream at the base of the hill slope. I came here during spring to survey steelhead, but this stream was also a survey location for other types of salmon during the fall. The game trails off of the logging road were flagged by previous surveyors, and multiple routes were marked. This made it kind of confusing, and not all routes actually led to the stream. Some just petered out once the vegetation got too thick. Another led to a cliff face overlooking the riverbed. Lots of faint trails. One day I turned off into the woods and saw one of the survey flags tied around a branch at the side of the road. I followed some pink flags heading south along the hillside. I noticed the trail seemed freshly turned up and figured maybe a bear clambered through recently since the time I was there last, 2 weeks previously. The trail led to a small claustrophobic clearing, and the ground was freshly torn up in the shape of a circle. Seemed strange. I was looking for elk tracks but didn't see any. Then I noticed an assortment of bones scattered around the edges of the clearing. These weren't there before. Everything was dead silent, and something about it was setting me on edge. I poked around the bones a bit, trying to piece together this scene. I noticed another slight path, which strayed from my main route, veering to the right from the clearing. I walked a bit down that way and gazed ahead, trying to see if this path was flagged. It was densely packed with trees. A subtle movement caught the corner of my eye ahead and to the right as I walked. I turned my head to look past the trees and saw the silhouette of a large shelter, maybe about 50 to 75 feet from the clearing. It was surrounded by what looked to be jugs and bones. Tons of plastic jugs. Light shapes of bones on the ground. The lighting made seeing anything else impossible. Everything was so quiet. I left in a hurry, off the trail, without trying to get a better look, without getting to the stream. The alarm bells in my brain were screaming. This story happens along a dead stretch of highway around 3 a.m. I was making the drive back home from the docks, and around 3 a.m. I started getting so exhausted it was getting unsafe for me to drive. I was falling asleep, slapping myself in the face and sticking my head out the windows, trying to do anything I could to stay awake and make it home, but nothing was working. So due to the time and location, there weren't any safe places I could park to get a little bit of rest. So in my sleep-deprived state, I figured since I hadn't seen anyone else on the highway with me, I'd just pull over to the side of the road and get some rest. I leave my truck running with the lights on and set an alarm for 45 minutes. Well, on that truck, when you put it into park, it automatically unlocks your doors. Thank God right before I fell asleep I had the presence of mind to relock all my doors, because about 10 minutes before my alarm went off I woke up to the sound of the door handle on the rear passenger door on my truck getting repeatedly yanked on, and it was shaking the whole truck. Needless to say, I was awake now and full of energy. All I can remember from the adrenaline dump that happened was I slammed the truck in gear and did probably the best burnout that truck has ever done, and threw rocks and smoke at whoever was behind me. The rest of the drive home, I remember swerving left and right, trying to make sure if someone was in the bed of my truck that I'd knock them out. I think the creepiest thing about that whole ordeal for me is that there isn't a way for me to prove that it happened. At the time the incident happened, I had been awake for over 24 hours. But I've also heard instances of that happening to people on that stretch of road. Call it a ghost, a dream, or some kids playing pranks on the poor people passing through town, but all I know is I'll never fall asleep parked on the side of the road again. Earlier this summer I was hiking in the 100-mile wilderness in Maine. A couple days into my trip, I got really sick. Sore throat, headache, fatigue, loss of appetite, about the worst cocktail of symptoms for hiking long distances. I had found a tick on me, and I was terrified that I might have Lyme disease. I decided to get off trail and see a doctor, which is easier said than done in the most remote, inaccessible section of the whole Appalachian Trail. Thankfully, there are old logging roads that crisscross the wilderness, so I decided to turn off onto a road that, I was told, led to a campground. There I hoped to find some day hikers and get a ride into town. As soon as I turned off the it started pouring rain, which only increased my misery. A few minutes later, I noticed a dog in the woods. Strange, I thought. Then I saw another dog. And another, and another. About a dozen big hunting hounds, fenced off, randomly in the middle of nowhere, Maine. They barked at me, slavering, and pawed at the chicken wire fence, which did not seem strong enough to contain them. This was slightly disconcerting, but the brown trouser moment came when I spotted a lone figure in the woods, what seemed like a tall man in a hooded blue rain jacket and pants. I couldn't see his face, and he just stood there, still as a statue. Severely spooked, I hiked out of there on the double. In the backcountry, it's generally good manners to say hello and exchange pleasantries, but this guy didn't say a word. Maybe it was because of the rain, or maybe he was feeding bodies to his hounds out there, I may never know. But he definitely saw me, and I could tell that he was watching me go past. Doing a big hike in Utah on a camping trip. A friend and I were doing a day hike during a camping trip in a pretty remote area of national forest. We got off course with a side trail about halfway into the hike for fun, probably 7 to 8 miles in the forest, and out of nowhere there's an open flat patch with roughly 15 teens dancing in unison wearing very odd matching clothes. There's a couple adults standing around in the same attire, and they're playing some very weird, almost enchanted music. The path is designed to walk straight to them, and it's somewhat thick otherwise, so it's not like we can just avoid them. Before we even started discussing what the hell is going on or what to do, they in unison froze and stared at us. The music stops. One of the adults starts banging a drum slowly, one beat at a time, and the group stands up straight and continues staring at us. No words were spoken, and my buddy and I turned and ran the duck back as fast as we could to the main trail, which, mind you, took some time being a few miles off the real trail. We never looked back until we got on the main trail. Saw nothing, but my God were we terrified. When we finally got back to our car, in the distance we saw one of the adults in that matching outfit standing at the tree line watching us. So he followed us a good 8 to 10 miles. That ended the camping trip. Went back to our site, packed, and left. My boyfriend and I went camping with 2 other couples. I took them to a favorite spot of mine about 3 hours out of town, and it was definitely deep into the forest. I had been going to it for years with my family, but our friends were more used to by the lake camping and are more city folk. I know the kind of people who are out there, like off-grid hippies and mostly tweakers. There's a known rumor of the meth labs out there, and I know to keep my mouth shut. Our friends, however, did not. So anyways, we had just eaten dinner and are all sitting by the campfire drinking when we suddenly hear someone yelling Marcus very loudly. It was a woman's voice, and she was obviously in distress, but the thing was, she was coming from east, which is the opposite direction anyone would be coming from, except for those tweakers. I instantly fell silent, not wanting to draw attention to our little group, but one of our friends yells back, "Pollo," thinking the woman had yelled Marco and thought it would be funny. Well, the woman heard our friend and proceeded to yell through the very dark night, asking us how to get to our camp. I told everyone to be quiet, hoping she would move along, but that's when she saw the fire. She continued to yell obscenities as she made her way towards us. At one point she clearly fell down the hill we were below because we could hear a crash and some wood crackle, which she also blamed on us because we were shining a very bright light at her and she couldn't see. The only light out there was the fire, and we still couldn't see her because of it. She was definitely tripping balls, which made me more anxious because you never know what someone like that will do. So after about 10 minutes of her trampling through the forest and falling down a few times, she finally started to walk into view. This was when the rest of my friends had that OSHT moment. She was clearly a meth head and in very bad shape, and she wanted to stay to eat and sleep in our camp. She insisted to the point of plopping her ass down on the ground next to us and refusing to leave. She had never once asked us to help her or if she could even come into our camp, and she was very rude. I would have been happy to help her, but she was high and very twitchy and pretty much demanded things from us that we weren't going to give. So my boyfriend, a very bulky and quite scary dude when you make him mad, finally stood up, grabbed her a water bottle, and told her she had to leave now. She whined some more in a very childish manner and yelled at us that we weren't God's children. But he forced her to get up, and she turned towards the way she came. She continued to yell into the night about how rude and unkind we were, nicer equivalents to what she said. At one point she dropped the water bottle we gave her, and she blamed us for that too. We could slowly hear her yelling, becoming farther and farther away. But what scared me the most was her coming back later. She already knew where we were. Let's just say none of us slept that night. And I hope to God my friends learned their lessons. You don't FK around in the forests. There are people out there who know it better than you. That's not the first time I've come into contact with unwanted people. I wanted to write about what happened to me and my partner in September 2023. We were hanging out with our two new friends, husband and wife. Let's say their names are John and Mary. They decided to camp at Todd Lake Recreation Center, which is in George Washington National Forest, and invited us to spend time at their campsite, have a few beers, relax by the campfire, etc. My partner and I decided we weren't up for overnight camping but were down to hang out for a bit. The recreation center was only 45 minutes from home, so we thought we could drive if we didn't have but a few drinks, ate food, and chilled for a couple of hours. So we get there around 4:30 p.m. and have camp snacks, sandwiches, chips, nothing special, and some alcoholic seltzers. We wander down to the lake and let their dog swim, then we decide to head back to the campsite and start a fire. I knew we weren't staying the night, so I kept track of how many drinks I had and the food I ate to ensure I was suitable for the drive later. In total, I had 5 seltzers the entire night, hours. Not to sound like an alcoholic or anything, but 5 seltzers do not explain what happened to us that night. I can handle my alcohol and am responsible while drinking by pacing myself, eating food, and drinking water in between each beverage. So we are hanging by the fire with John and Mary, and next thing you know, John says, "Hey, do you guys want to walk down to the lake?" And we respond, "Yeah, sure, let's do it." The campsite has a short walking path to the lake, probably 0.5 miles away. It should only take minutes to get there. Now, this is when it gets weird. I look at my cell phone and see it is 8:30 p.m. and decide to put my phone in the car before we walk down to the lake because I don't want to lose it. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the woods, passed out on the ground on a trail with my partner in the middle of George Washington National Forest, an hour away from their campsite, and John and Mary were nowhere to be found. My partner was on his back with his head turned to the side, and I was lying halfway on the moss, and the other half on him with my head turned to the side. Almost as if we were placed perfectly. We were lost, and both felt extremely confused and sick. We both started throwing up and had to take breaks while walking out to try and find John and Mary's campsite. It took us an hour to get back, and it appears we had hiked an hour outside of the recreation center. We both had zero recollection of how we got there, why we were both passed out in the middle of the woods at night, and why the hell 5 seltzers with food over a multiple hour span made either one of us be so sick and lose memory at the same time. My partner was completely disoriented and started screaming for help. I was begging him to be quiet because I felt so sick and had no idea where we were. I needed a moment to collect myself and get my bearings to try and hike out of our current situation. Something to know about us is we are both avid hikers and backpackers and very comfortable outdoors in nature, even alone. However, at that moment, I was so thankful I didn't wake up in the woods at night on a trail alone. Thankfully, he was with me. The entire time, we both felt like we were being watched as we tried to find our way back. It was unsettling. I was telling my partner when we were trying to find our way back to the campsite something felt very wrong, and when we got back, we needed to get in the car and leave. I felt it in my bones, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what happened. We were both utterly shocked that we somehow both conveniently blacked out simultaneously. I know what you all are thinking, were we drugged? We felt that, too. But why would John and Mary, our supposed friends, drug us? And why would they drug us and carry us deep into the forest? It didn't add up. We finally make it back to the campsite, and I first open my car and grab my phone to see what time it is. It was 2:30 a.m. My heart sank. How did this happen? How did it go from 8:30 p.m., when we were walking down to the lake, which was 0.5 miles or less from their campsite, to 2:30 in the morning? Neither of us liked not knowing what happened to us in that lost time. So before we decided to leave, my partner knocked on their tent and said, "Hey, John. We are leaving." "What happened, man? We need to get out of here, something's off." John then replies, "Where is Mary?" And my partner and I both look at each other concerned and say to John, "What do you mean she's not in the tent with you?" And John replies, "No, I thought she was with you too." That's when we all decided to search for Mary. John said the last thing he remembered was we were hanging out by the fire and asked if we wanted to go down to the lake, and then hours later, he woke up underneath the picnic table at the campsite, not remembering how he got there. However, something seemed fishy, and he was far too relaxed. We found Mary down the trail to the lake, slumped over, asleep in the woods near the campsite. Neither remembered what happened or why we all ended up in these places. No one can remember what happened for those few hours. It was misty, dark, and foggy on the mountain, and I was shivering, teeth chattering, feeling sick, and just ready to go home. We got in the car and returned to our house, but it took a while to settle enough to sleep. When we spoke to John the next morning, they laughed it off and said, "Ha ha, maybe we shouldn't drink so much next time we hang out." I remember all of us hanging by the fire and then mentioning us going down to the lake, but I stayed back to deal with the dog, and you three went down there. John changed his story from what he said the night before. Something didn't sit right with me. The Todd Lake Recreation Center was almost empty. We only saw one other family camping that night, and they weren't anywhere near our campsite, which was also odd. My partner and I don't feel we drink enough to the point it would cause us to black out, especially at the same time. So what did happen? We were sore and a little cut up, but our only thoughts were that this must have been something paranormal, or they did drug us. I started to get flashbacks of memory, and all I remember was John's face on the beach, then black. Did aliens abduct us? Was it something from Appalachian folklore, like Mothman or some other bizarre creature? Did we all drink too much? Did we get drugged? My partner lost his phone that night, so I called the ranger the following Monday. And they said they found it in the woods busted up between campsites 5 and 6, but John and Mary were camping at campsite 1. The ranger mailed it back to us because I didn't want to drive back there. I had a horrible pit in my stomach. The phone never cut back on, even though the front of the screen was perfectly intact. It was only the back of the phone that was busted. A part of me doesn't want to know what's on that iPhone. The next day, my partner was violently ill, and I was shivering with teeth chattering and chill bumps all day. We honestly probably should have gone to the hospital. In my 30 years, I've never experienced anything like this, and to this day, we are skeptical about meeting new friends or having new people enter our lives. Either way, we are both so grateful we made it home safely that night, and we have each other. What do you all think? My partner doesn't have social media, but I blocked John and Mary on mine, and we haven't seen them since. We moved to another state in 2024, not because of this reason, but I've dealt with a lot of PTSD and night terror since this occurred. I now worry if it was John or both of them. Are they doing this to other people? I was out camping one night by myself and started hearing voices. I was playing music, and it was around 2 in the morning. My grandma's house was about 2 miles down the river, and I thought it might have been my grandpa, so I turned off my music so I could tell back, but I heard a dog, and my grandma, or music so I could tell back, but I heard a dog, and my grandma or grandpa don't have dogs. Then I heard someone say, the noise was this way. This genuinely freaked me out, so I climbed one of the pine trees and sat up there about 5 to 7 minutes later. I saw a flashlight in the distance and noticed 2 people walking up. They were both men, and there was, I believe, a husky German hybrid among them. They ransacked my camp, and I swear they should have noticed me because they shined the lights around and pasted right over me. After they left, I started to walk home because, duck that shit. I heard 2 loud bangs, sounded like a rifle, and I booked it. When I got home, I stood on the porch for a second and saw their lights at the edge of the woods. I can assure you, I will never camp alone again. It wasn't even hunting season, so they shouldn't have even been out with a gun, and if they were, it should have been at least a handgun, not a rifle, but I'm still not sure what kind of gun it was. I hate dark forests now though, and I got hella bad paranoia from this. Last summer I went camping with a few friends in Algonquin Park in Ontario. It's amazing, you pay to rent a site in the park, then you portage as much as you like and find an empty spot. None of the spots are near each other, so you really do feel quite alone out there. Anyway, we get to our spot, we set up, we get a fire lit, and so on. We'd been warned that there had been a few bear sightings in the area, so take the usual precautions. Once it got dark, one of the girls started getting a little freaked out. She didn't want to walk to her tent on her own and just felt a bit uneasy. It's understandable. When you walk away from the fire, the darkness completely swallows you. So at one stage, this girl needs to pee and obviously asks for an escort. One of the guys got up and started walking with her and suddenly stopped and said, "There's someone out there." The girl assumes he's just trying to mess with her, but he looks at her, then back at us, with an extremely convincing panicked expression. We all assume he's full of shit. Still, it's enough to get everyone a little riled up. I'm about to chastise him for messing with someone who's clearly not enjoying it when we all hear a few twigs snapping. It's startling, but we assume it's an animal, though that in itself is quite jarring. Out of nowhere, this crazed shirtless dude with a beard and long, messy hair comes sprinting towards us. I don't think I've ever been so close to pissing myself. I was completely frozen, and I'm not usually particularly jumpy. Also, there's not that much light, so first you just see a shape coming towards you rapidly. This is so unnecessarily drawn out, sorry. Anyway, the dude stops, holds up his arms, and says something about finding civilization. It turns out he's tripping balls and decided to leave his campsite and go for a midnight paddle and ended up near our site. We invited him to chill with us, mostly so we wouldn't be reading about a tragic drowning in the news shortly thereafter. The guy falls asleep in one of our hammocks and is gone the next morning. I assume he found his way home. I was backpacking with my dog and about 12 miles from the road and trailhead, so pretty far from people, though popular enough that other hikers might be around, though we saw no one all day. About 2 a.m., my dog started this really low, deep growl and woke me up. Turn on my headlamp and see his teeth showing, and he's right on top of me. I hear heavy footsteps, black bear/moose? Near the tent. I leash my dog so he doesn't tear through the tent, and the footsteps move further away, but keep circling my tent. All of my food and toiletries are hung in a tree in a bear bag, nothing in the tent to draw a bear's attention. I clap my hands, something is still slowly circling, not something a moose would do, and a bear might if he wanted food, but I've got nothing and a really big dog with me. I decide to step out of the tent with the leash in one hand and bear spray in the other, yelling, "Hey bear." The footsteps stop, the dog's nose is in the air telling me to look right, but nothing in my headlamp that I can see. I didn't hear anything go off, but it's quiet. I give it 5 minutes or so, get back in the tent, and it starts up again, slowly circling maybe 50 feet from me. Maybe an hour later, I hear the footsteps wander off into the woods. At dawn, I take the dog and the bear spray and start looking for tracks. I find a clear path in the leaves that had been trampled, but no tracks. The dog's nose is on the ground, and I follow his lead, and he follows the loop around our campsite. We finally see a few human footprints, not shoe tracks, a regular size, not Bigfoot, bare human foot. Plus, yup, a human turd and toilet paper. Some hole was wandering around the middle of nowhere, near the tent, and circling my tent for an hour or more, and left a dump for me to find. My husband, kid, and I live on a 100-acre plot of land in the middle of nowhere on a plot of land that's about 100 acres. I'd say probably 95 of those acres are wilderness with ATVs and hiking trails that we, and several of the previous owners, created by exploring. We use that land for camping, hiking, and hunting. We like to find a spot, clear it a bit, and camp overnight. There's so much space, and we've never stayed in the same place twice. We've seen some kill sites, both old and fresh. Lots of animal tracks, places where deer bed down, etc. I've even spent a lot of time hiking solo while the kid is in school and my husband is at work. Whether alone or with the family, we always carry a firearm for protection. A few weeks ago, we decided to load up our camping gear and start a new trail. We marked the trails we make with spray paint on trees. We were pretty far in the woods, having hiked almost an hour when the atmosphere seemed to change. I don't know who noticed it first, but my husband, who was leading the three of us, turned around and gave me a concerned look. The birds had stopped chirping, and the insects were quiet. There were no sounds around us. When in the woods, complete quietness is rarely a good thing. We continued onward, hyper-aware of our surroundings, while our kid continued merrily talking. We came to the stream that marks the midway point of our property. We stopped for a few minutes, my husband and I in a stare-down with each other. We both felt something was off but didn't want to scare our daughter. I finally broke the silence and said I suddenly didn't feel good and that we should go home. My husband nodded in agreement while our daughter voiced her protest. "Too bad, kiddo." We turned around and started back. After going a few hundred yards, still in silent wilderness, I looked to my right and saw a person crouched down in a ghillie suit about 150 feet off our trail. I'm sure they saw that I noticed them, but they never moved. I cleared my throat to get my husband's attention, and when he looked back, I put my hand on the gun in the holster on my hip, which caused him to readjust his rifle in preparation for anything. I sped up my family, and we hurried back home. I told my husband as soon as we were inside. We decided to call the police and report the trespasser. Filed a report and was told to call again if we saw anyone. A few days later, my husband and I went out alone and set up a bunch of deer cams. We didn't go back out into the woods for maybe a week, but then he and I ventured out to retrieve the cam footage. Out of the 9 cameras we placed, we caught a person in a ghillie suit in 2 images. We handed copies over to the cops for our report. We haven't gone back out since except to check the deer cams. Haven't gotten any other trespassers. It freaks me out even more to think of the few times, while camping, that we heard walking near our tent in the middle of the night. We always assumed it was curious animals, but now I'm not so sure. During college, which was located away from major cities, the woods were all around us. That being said, there was a highly rated trail, the Loyalsock Trail, which was about an hour drive from the university. I invited a friend to come with me, as he had never been on an extended backpacking trip. We planned to trek over a 50-plus mile trail during the 4-day weekend. I am an Eagle Scout who has spent countless hours in the woods and went on backpacking trips consistently throughout my college experience. As many have said before me, you get used to the minor spooky things happening, coyote howls, raccoons in the middle of the night, even the occasional unknown noise. People, however, are the scariest thing to find in the woods. We were about 20 miles into the trail, and, being Pennsylvania, where the underbrush and trees line the trails pretty densely, I always walk about 100 meters off of the trail to reduce the chances of me disturbing people, especially in the early morning when I choose to sleep in. Following that same strategy, my friend and I go out of our way to be in this amazing spot a good ways off of the trail, where it would even be difficult to see our flashlights from the trail. This spot was on a peninsula where a creek met a river, meaning there was only one way into our camp and only one way out. We start a fire, cook our food, and drink some, but not enough to get either of us drunk. We put the fire out about midnight and headed into our individual tents. All is quiet. It is the fall semester, so leaves are on the ground, the moon is brightly shining through the bare trees, and the air is cool. The only noise is the occasional time when I would hear my friend turn over in his sleep. Then I hear the voices. The voices sounded very close for being on the trail 100 plus meters away. I check my watch, 3 a.m. Who hikes at 3 a.m.? We are 20 miles in. I slowly get out of my sleeping bag and unzip my tent, only to see my friend peeking out of his tent in the exact same fashion. He quickly moves his finger over his mouth in an exaggerated hush signal, then uses the same hand to frantically motion toward the trail. They are then seen. 4 adults, 3 men and 1 woman, are walking directly towards our camp. No lights are illuminating their path, they are walking silently at this point. Only one of them has a backpack, an impossibility for the long hike they were 1/3 of the way through. Being a long trip, you bring woodcutting supplies to chop branches into smaller branches to burn. For me, this was a survival knife. Grabbing the knife, believing it is my only way of defending myself, I am more disheveled than I ever have been, especially knowing that a knife is barely defense at all. These people walk into our site, sit down by our extinguished fire pit, and just sit there for what felt like an eternity. My friend speaks up and asks what they are doing in our campsite. Without answering the question, they ask if we have any food. Having packed as lightly as possible for the long trip, we had only a few extra Mountain House, MRE-style meals. I grab one out of my bag and toss it to one of the men. In rapid succession, I ask why they aren't using a light, if they need help finding the trail, and why they are hiking so late. They respond with the following. We don't use lights. We know where the trail is, and it is better to hike late at night. Unnerved at this point, my friend asks them to leave. They respond by asking if we want to light the fire and hang out for a bit. No, we do not. They grab their bag, get up, and leave without speaking another word. We watch them leave and take shifts, making sure that they don't come back. Needless to say, we both got very little sleep that night. When the sun rose the next morning, we finally got real sleep. By the afternoon, when we woke up, it all felt like a weird dream of sorts. The only evidence was a fuzzy cap that they must have dropped that I have to this day. I have never had something as weird/spooky as that happen in the woods and hope to never have it happen again. In the 8 years since that trip, I haven't been back to the Loyalsock Trail. I spent a summer in Wyoming going to BLM land and other remote locations collecting data on bats and herpetofauna. Heard a lot of weird noises, like mountain lions screaming, deer snorting, and what sounded like owls fighting. I woke up one morning to find 2 bull moose sleeping 20 yards behind my tent. All of this was part of the job until one night a truck was driving towards us when we were on a BLM square in the southwestern part of the state. The truck was going over land, no road, and was slowly driving at us. It stopped about 100 yards away, turned off the lights, and we could see a person get out. They walked a full circle around us at 100 yards away, got back in the truck, and turned around. This was after dark, and this shadowy figure did a complete circle around us. You could hear them walking through the sagebrush, and I'm sure they heard us talking. We packed up after that and drove to a hotel an hour away. I called the office and told them I was taking a gun when we went back out. Didn't like having the bear mace as our only defense. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country. But instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers, we discovered bridges no one went to, we fished, we hid from trains. At night we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times. Never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family in the day, and at night we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. The day came, and we started out early morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot where we used to start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we'd take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, so I gave a what the hell, and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint, and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area with trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from on top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet, no movement could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to be sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all, it was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place, also weathered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in, we didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to the spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on at early morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and shot the shit, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. Do you hear that? What the duck is that? It sounds like people singing. And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still walk very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree, but it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church. And the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, can you believe this shit? The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually it got to the point where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and disturbing that I covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point I was just getting ready to say, let's get the duck out of here, when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, they're coming out. We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walk out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move toward us and the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our stuff, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that happened to me out in the woods. I do a lot of stream work, so I spend time out in pretty rural areas walking streams and rivers. Once my coworker and I were working in a more urban environment and came across what we initially thought was a body, which of course triggered OSHT from us, but it ended up being a firefighter's dummy that had fallen down a hill. We felt pretty dumb. Other notable things include a small grave in the middle of nowhere for someone's dog, pretty sad, a stuffed rabbit with shotgun shells placed where its eyes should be, a mannequin very purposely placed in a chair in the middle of the woods, and lots of little random altars. I also did work in Myrtle Beach, what a hellhole, and accidentally walked into an inhabited homeless camp. I was peering into a stormwater grate when I looked up and saw a homeless person standing in his shelter, staring at us and saying nothing. I felt like I was trespassing, so we quietly left. Definitely not unexplainable, but sent chills down my spine just the same. For context, I'm 25 and female with a long history of doing stuff out in nature all by my lonesome. Sorry, Mom and Dad. Last year I quit my job as a cheesemaker and hopped on a train for a position as a line cook at a little rundown family-owned Greasy Spoon on the res right outside Glacier National Park in Montana. They had a little trailer park out back for the staff, and I got to live in a one-room cabin the manager's granddad built back in the day. The park itself was just a 15-minute walk from my cabin, and I often went hiking on the Red Eagle Lake Trail, since it was the one trail I didn't need to wait around for a shuttle to access, and it tended to get less traffic than the others. I'd gone out there hoping to do lots of backcountry camping, but the cafe worked us like dogs 6 days a week usually, so I only made it out twice on a couple solos. Now, at Red Eagle Lake, there are 2 campsites, the upper and lower. The first time I camped, I stayed at the lower campsite, which is usually more busy. The second and last time, right before I returned home, I stayed at the smaller upper campsite. When I got there, I hung up my bear hang, set up my tent, and spent some time poking around the lake and watching deer till it got dark. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to snuffling noises and loud, hollow footsteps right outside my tent door. Being half asleep and a dumbass, I completely unzipped my door. I meant to unzip the window, but the whole door opened, and I found myself looking up at a huge-ass bull moose the size of a ducking SUV. He had been just munching on huckleberry shrubs. He froze when he heard my door unzip, they don't see very well, hesitated a moment, and then shot off into the hills faster than I could ever imagine something that big moving. Scared the shit out of me. I kept hearing other moose around me throughout the night, and actually it was kind of comforting. No spooky mountain lions or paranormal spooks could possibly be around if there were moose, right? The next morning I packed up and was humping my shit out past the lower campground. It had been empty when I passed it the day before, but now I noticed there was a group of a half dozen guys there. Now, I met lots of dudes on the trail, and 99.99% of them are perfectly friendly, really chill, and harmless. But as I walked through this campground, every head snapped up and clocked me as I passed through, and I felt panic alarms go off in my gut. They all stood totally still and didn't say a word. I had to walk right past one of these guys at the bear hang, and he just leered at me creepily and said, "Hey." I was wearing big, black sunglasses and in my best lady bro voice shot back, "Hey yo, what's up?" And then tried not to poop myself as I marched up the trail till they couldn't see me. I've spent a lot of time in the woods alone and have often been grateful that I'm a taller, sort of stocky, and kind of androgynous lady. I've also spent a lot of time wandering Seattle late at night and early in the morning. That by far was the most in danger I've ever felt. Don't want to feel that way ever again. Nope. This was during the middle of August in North Texas summer 2023, so the nighttime temperatures were around 100 degrees. My dad and one of my brothers, who's 11, drove an hour north into the countryside to go stargazing for my brother's Scout Merit badge. There are some twisty gravel roads in the forest as you approach Black Creek Lake. We got to see a coyote, a deer, and 2 raccoons. We live in a city, so we don't often see such animals. We thought that'd be our excitement for the night. We then finally made it to the recreational park grounds beside the lake. Layout is simple. If you're standing in the round parking lot, then the campgrounds are to the north and west, the lake is south, and the path in and out is east of us. There are no official campgrounds east of this recreational area, which is important for later. We got there around 10 p.m. and set up. We were able to successfully see some stars through my telescope as well as Saturn, which was exciting for us. Throughout this whole time though, there were 2 parties or what might have been one group in the parking lot and surrounding nearby area. One party was kayaking and then later fishing from the boat ramp area west of us. To the north in the lot were 2 cars. From that direction, we were constantly hearing the loud, irritating voice of a woman who was obviously in a bad mood and didn't want to be there. She continuously cursed at someone or no one in particular, and at one point was raged at someone for taking her keys and obstructing her from driving, which obviously made it sound like she was drunk or under some other influence. At one point in the night, around 11 p.m., we hear someone loudly, sporadically, honk one of the car horns over and over in random patterns. Then we hear the obnoxious woman rudely tell someone to wake up, over and over again, then proceed to hold down the horn for a few seconds at a time and continue her assault on the horn in our ears. By this point, my family and I are just about ready to leave due to this loud commotion. I personally was fixing to go over there myself and tell her off, but I knew that probably wasn't the best idea. I definitely didn't want to put myself and my unborn baby in any danger. Then, for about 20 to 30 minutes, we were able to watch the stars in relative peace with little noise coming from the other 2 parties. Fortunately, none of these people were directly involved with what happened next, but it may have been the cause. Just before midnight, we packed up our stargazing stuff and got in the car. Now, the gravel path to exit is up a slight hill or slope, meaning from the parking lot you can't see past where the path goes up and around a couple trees. We drive up the hill, and just as the headlights came back down to illuminate the path in front of us and the trees to our right side, it was right then and there that we see a man, wearing only black shorts and no shirt. The timing was straight out of a horror movie, to suddenly see someone out of nowhere. He was in his late 20s or 30s and had short, dark hair. Just as the light hit him, he was standing and walking right there, just to the right of our car in front of us at a very close distance, only a couple feet away. Guy had been walking in our direction, and upon seeing us, he quickly raised both his arms to flip us off with both hands. He keeps his hands and arms raised and is quickly and loudly saying something to us with anger or something in his voice. We couldn't understand what he was saying though, since we had the radio on, and all this happened quickly. The second the man saw us, he started walking toward our car faster. My dad was driving slowly initially to avoid the agitated man, thinking he might need help. My dad, in a confused voice, says, "What is he doing?" But I just reply, "Nope, go go go." And we sped off. I knew that this was not a situation where we needed to stick around and ask questions. It freaked me out a little imagining what would have happened if the guy had reached the car a few seconds later if we hadn't sped off. I'm not very familiar with my dad's car, and it scares me that I might have ended up pressing the wrong button to lock my door and the guy could have opened it and done who knows what. We left and never had anything else happen. But we did wonder who that guy was and where he came from. The direction he was walking from had no official campgrounds, only the forest. Maybe he lived in one of the scattered houses in the woods we'd passed by on our long journey. I wondered why he had been walking in our direction, toward the recreational area. My best theory is that he wanted to confront the group that had been honking the horn and waking up the entire forest, but upon seeing our car leave, maybe he thought it had been us making the racket. Even if that's not it or the man needed help, which is not likely considering his reaction to us, I couldn't help but feel a sense of danger. I hope that no harm came to those other two parties that night. Me and some friends went camping in a field next to a forest in the middle of nowhere. It started getting dark, so we lit a fire and everything and were all sitting around it, and I could see someone moving along the ridge of a hill about 200 feet away from us, just walking straight across in the darkness, at about 9 p.m. at night. I thought this was a bit weird, and maybe it was like a police officer or something about to tell us to leave, but they just carried on walking straight past and eventually disappeared over the edge of the ridge when I stopped seeing movement. Then me and some of the group went to get some old sticks and stuff for firewood from just inside the forest, so we walked about 10 feet in, and I started to hear this very heavy breathing from behind me, and I turned around and there was nothing there, except the noise of really heavy breathing, like someone panting. The guy next to me heard it and turned around with the torch, still nothing, but we were both really freaked out and just watched for ages, and although we couldn't make out any solid shapes because the forest was too dense, we could see something moving around between the trees, getting further and further away, with the heavy breathing leaving with it. So we did the only thing we could think of and legged it back to the tents. This happened about 6 years ago. As stated, I was about 12 and my brother was 26 at the time. My brother had been serving in the US Army for several years when this happened and was deploying to the Middle East on his second deployment, if I remember correctly. Also noteworthy was that he is a Green Beret and had recently, 3 or 4 months prior to this trip, completed the Army Special Forces qualification course, Robin Sage and all that, and by then was an active duty SF engineer sergeant. Definitely not someone you'd want to duck around with. Given that we both grew up with a passion for the outdoors, he thought it would be enjoyable to take me on a backpacking trip in northern Alabama, the Sipsey Wilderness for those familiar with the area, before he left for 9 months. The trip had gone smoothly up until the third night we were camping out. Around 8 p.m. we had our camp set up, eaten dinner, and were sitting by the fire talking about typical boy shit, guns, girls, etc. For some reference, our spot was about 50 yards from a large stream and about 50 yards downhill adjacent to the large path. Our camp, the stream, and the path formed a triangle of sorts. This was summertime in Alabama, so it wasn't quite dark yet when two guys, who looked to be in their late 20s, wandered up and asked if we had seen any hogs while we were hiking around. Given that this is rural Alabama, we actually had seen some farther into the wilderness area and told them so. Even though they were relatively polite, my brother called them good old boys. I got a seriously creepy vibe from them: dirty clothes, greasy hair, scraggly facial hair, etc. I think they probably looked like they belonged in the movie Deliverance. They kind of hung out for a few minutes, maybe a little longer than they should have, looking around, asking us questions like how long we had been out there, how long we were staying, and what looked like them kind of sizing us up. They then abruptly said goodbye and walked away. I didn't necessarily feel threatened by them, and I know for sure my brother didn't either, but I still felt uneasy about the whole thing. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours. My brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestled in our tent when I woke to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, and they sounded like they were only about 100 yards away. My heart immediately started pounding, and I kicked my brother through my sleeping bag and asked if he was awake or had heard the dogs. He responded, "I'm awake, they've been getting closer for the past hour or so, just lay still and don't make any sounds." Needless to say, 12-year-old me was about to shit my pants. We would also hear sporadic shouts from several different sources, but neither came any closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hogs, they use the dogs to pin them down, and then they shoot them." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow I managed to fall back asleep. The fact that they were doing this at night was a huge red flag, my brother later told me, but I think he was just trying to keep me calm. Fast forward what was probably another 3 hours, around 2 a.m. I had managed to sleep pretty well after first hearing the hog hunters when I woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder firmly, saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on quick, and follow me, be as quiet as you can." My heart immediately went back to racing when I heard the dogs and voices in the distance, farther away than before but still distinct. Not asking any questions, I did what he said, and as soon as we were out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. This was a breeze for him after rucking with God knows how much weight in the army. We snuck about 50 yards into the woods towards the junction of the path and the stream and crawled into some bushes. It was up a hill, so we had a pretty good elevated view of our campsite. I remember as we were laying there how loudly I was breathing and how quiet he was when I heard the very distinct sound of a pistol slide racking. I looked over, and my brother had his pistol, a HK-USP that he gave to me a few years after this story took place, and was watching the campsite and surrounding area. I started to whisper to him when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed at the campsite. The group of hunters had been steadily approaching our camp and by this time, 30 or so minutes, had reached it. There were 5 of them, and like 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked relatively young, but 2 had either rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going crazy, obviously having smelled our scent. For those of you who are backpackers/campers, nobody comes up on a random camp in the middle of the night with dogs and guns and has good intentions. I knew this, and my brother knew it. I was scared shitless. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me they were talking about us, although he hadn't heard any specifics either. They lingered for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and talking to themselves, when my brother put his mouth to my ear and said, "If they come towards, I want you to turn and run as quickly as you can. Don't stop, don't look back, stay off the trail and look for the flashing lights." I didn't know what he meant by this, but that'll come later. I knew I could make it back because he had taught me land nav pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight and told me not to take the red filter off. He told me later that the red filter helps preserve night vision and cuts down ambient light so it would be harder for someone to see from a distance. At this point I was so scared I almost started crying, but at the same time I had a rush of adrenaline, and what I think now is confidence that he thought I could handle myself. We lay there for a while longer when, out of nowhere, they started screaming, "Where y'all at?" and firing into the woods at random. My brother dragged me back behind the crest of the hill and threw himself on top of me. Thankfully, from our position on top of the hill, we were protected from any gunfire. They shot maybe 5 or 6 more times and then started walking back the direction they had come. They got maybe 100 yards away when I heard a blaring siren and saw emergency lights flashing through the woods. Turns out my brother had called the Forest Service office on a satellite phone my family has for emergencies while I was asleep, and they had sent out Forest Service officers and game wardens to our area of the wilderness. The Sipsey Wilderness is about 25,000 acres in size, so it took them a while to get there on the dirt roads. When we saw the game warden truck, my brother signaled them with the light and pointed them in the direction the hunters had gone, and the guy sped off, shining his spotlight through the woods. As soon as they were all gone, we went back to our camp, packed up our shit, and waited by the path for the game warden to come back, who then gave us a ride in his truck bed back to the main staging area. On the drive back, my brother told me how brave I had been and that we would talk about it with our parents the next day if I wanted to. I asked him not to do that because I thought they might never let me go camp again. Creepy rednecks in the woods, let's not meet again, you might get shot next time. Follow up, we never got any definitive information on what happened to the rednecks we encountered. I have many friends who have gone out to the Sipsey area and had a great time with no creepy stuff going on. However, it is truly a wilderness area, and law enforcement response, if you can even reach them, would be slow. I was lucky that my brother was there and reacted so quickly, otherwise, who knows what could have happened. We also got lucky that whatever their intentions were, they either reconsidered or lost interest. I will note that when they left our camp, the game warden showed up pretty soon afterwards, but I didn't see what the guys and their dogs did. If I remember correctly, they headed in a direction parallel to the stream, away from the trail that was inaccessible to any kind of vehicle. Maybe the warden continued on and took another trail to try and cut them off? We waited around 30 minutes for him to come back, and he said there were other officers out looking. There are only so many paths that you could take a truck or quad bike down, so any thorough search effort would also have to be done on foot. I'm a 17-year-old guy currently living in Phoenix, Arizona. This incident took place around 6 months ago on an overnight trip into the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail because I've been doing this stuff long enough to realize what happens when you post stuff on the internet. Whether it's a good trail, an abandoned mine, ghosts, or whatever it may be, people come flocking, usually with a lot of trash and loud music. Anyway, this particular trail I was taking was an 8-mile loop through a canyon. Pretty simple in and out overnight trip. I had planned to go with my friend, but a last-minute cancellation on his part left me on my own. So, with a packed bag and car ready to go, I decided to go on my own. Not leaving the house on time and having some trouble navigating rough forest roads, I didn't arrive at the trailhead until around 5:45, which, for those of you who don't backpack, is a major no. I had about a 4-mile hike until I arrived at my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast, so I figured if I moved quick enough I could get at least 2 to 3 miles in before I had to find a spot. This strategy left me hiking a very dark trail on my own, with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Hiking in the dark by itself is scary, especially for where I was and being on my own. Eventually it got so dark that I could only see where my headlamp was pointing, and that's when I figured I needed to stop and get a camp set up. With only using the headlamp as my light source and trying to move fast, I ended up in a less than ideal spot, but there were some burnt pieces of wood and the remains of a fire circle, so it looked like people had been there before, but definitely not recently. My first priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area around me and was able to find some dry wood, and I got the fire going. I got my tarp set up and cracked open a can of chili mac I had brought for myself and was very much looking forward to eating. I was feeling good, my camp was set up, and my food was on the fire. The feeling of uneasiness from the hike in had almost gone away, but it was still there, side effect of camping alone in remote areas. To fully understand what happened, I have to explain to you how my camp was set up. The site I had picked was a small clearing surrounded by large pine trees, with the trail about 30 feet to my left. When you're in the woods and have a fire going, the fire casts a circle of light around it, and everything on the edge of that circle and past it is pitch black. I was sitting on the ground near my fire eating my dinner when a small rock about the size of a marble was thrown into my camp. I looked at the tiny rock in shock, as I was positive that I was the only person on this trail that night. I accidentally turned my light on and towards the area where I had seen the rock come from, but due to the density of the pines and brush, I could only see about 10 feet. I spent the next 15 minutes in disbelief as I scanned the tree line that surrounded me searching for what or whoever had thrown the rock, not daring to stray too far from my fire that, in hindsight, offered me a false sense of security. After sitting back down and spending the rest of my time on high alert, I was able to convince myself that I had somehow kicked the rock or fallen from a tree. I went to sleep that night, not expecting the pure terror that was about to unfold. I woke to the sound of rustling leaves, barely inaudible if you weren't listening for them, but they were there. Still in a sleepy daze, I listened as the rustling of leaves got harder to hear as I assumed they were moving away from me. I went to grab my handheld flashlight that I had left next to me when I had fallen asleep, but the more I looked, the more scared I got as I came to realize that it was no longer there. I stood up in my sleeping bag, ducked out of my tarp, and looked around. I was able to see a light off in the woods. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. It was my flashlight, laying on the ground in a pile of leaves. This is one of the few moments in my life where I have almost spit my pants. The flashlight that I had left sitting right next to me when I had fallen asleep a few hours ago was now 15 feet away from me, past the tree line in the woods. I hurriedly slipped my boots on, clutching my knife in my other hand and keeping my head on a swivel. I weighed my options: stay here and wait out the night or attend the 3-mile hike back to the car in the dark. I figured that whatever or whoever was out here with me was definitely going to have a better advantage if I was out on the trail without a light, so I decided to stay at the camp and wait out the night there. Eventually it came back. I could hear it walking through the woods. It was far off, but I could hear it. It sounded like someone leisurely walking by, like they were on a stroll without a care in the world. Sometimes it would walk too far away and I would lose the sound of its steps, but then, an hour later, maybe 2, it would return, still faint as ever. This went on for about 3 or 4 hours until I listened to the steps get closer and closer until they were about 7 feet from me. At this point the fire had gotten very small as I had run out of wood in my pile. The footsteps stopped, and everything went totally silent. I sat there still for 2 hours, clutching a knife in my hand, and prayed that I wouldn't hear anything else. I stayed like that until the sun cast enough light that I could see that I was alone in my campsite. I packed my things and speed walked the 3 miles back down the trail I had taken. I arrived at the empty dirt road where my car was parked and nearly sprinted to it as I unlocked my Subaru, jumped in and drove, and didn't stop until I had put at least 20 miles between me and that place. I stopped at a gas station in Apache Junction to buy a Red Bull, but mostly just to see and or talk to another person. As I exited the store, I was able to read what was written in the dust on the back window of my car: "Sleep well?" A lot of weird things have happened to me on my various adventures through Arizona, but this is the weirdest and scariest by far, so I thought I'd share it. There is a seriously deranged person living in the Superstition Mountains. Do yourself a favor and stay as far away from those mountains as you can. Not really camping, but as kids, we lived in a new neighborhood. It was next to about 400 acres of woods and old farmland. There were several abandoned houses and barns, equipment, and random junk. It was great to grow up there, as we spent nearly every day exploring the area. But there was one house off the main road, but about 200 yards into the woods. It looked abandoned, but a woman lived there. We found out the hard way by trying to get into the house one day, and she came out screaming at us to get the hell off her property. She was scary, looking as hell. She wore a dirty dress, had gross, stringy hair, and looked like she hadn't taken a shower for years. She looked to be in her 30s. Needless to say, we stayed away from her most of the time. We also never told our parents because we knew that they wouldn't let us play back there anymore. We did go back sometime though. We named her Crazy Mary, and we'd spy on her here and dare each other to get as close as possible. Even then, we never got closer than 100 feet from her house. About 10 to 12 years later, I am home from college, and my mom tells me about how they took this woman to the mental hospital. Apparently she lived there this whole time with her dead mother and father propped up in their chairs in the living room. They figured the parents were dead for 10 to 15 years but died of natural causes, and Mary had propped them up in the chairs after they died. That meant they were probably freshly dead when we got chased away by Crazy Mary. This happened 5 years ago in Northern California, but I won't provide more details. Feel free to ask questions. My name is Sarah, and the night my friend Emily and I stumbled upon a terrifying cult in the woods was supposed to be a fun adventure. Emily's then boyfriend had recommended the forest to us, having hiked there before. I had just moved from my home country in Europe to the US 1 year earlier because I met an American guy who had been studying in my country. Despite being an avid hiker and having explored trails in various parts of Europe and Asia, I never expected that this hike would turn into a nightmare. As a blonde girl with blue eyes, I've had my fair share of experiencing weird things and dangerous situations while hiking. But what we encountered that night was like something out of a Hollywood movie. None of us had ever been there before, but we had heard that it was beautiful and peaceful. As we hiked deeper into the woods, we began to notice strange symbols etched into the trees and rocks. The symbols appeared to be a mix of geometric shapes and abstract patterns. Some were simple lines and circles, while others were more complex and seemed to be intertwined with one another. Some of the symbols appeared to be repeating, while others were unique. As we hiked deeper into the woods, we saw more and more of these symbols etched into the landscape. They seemed to be guiding us towards the ritual site, as if they were marking the path to something important. It was an eerie feeling, as if we were trespassing in a sacred place to which we didn't belong. I researched the meaning of the symbols later on, but it was difficult to say. They didn't seem to be connected to any specific religion or cult, but rather a product of some mystic or spiritual belief. It was as if they had been created by someone with a deep understanding of both geometry and mysticism. Looking back on it now, it's difficult not to think about how strange those symbols were and what kind of belief system they might have represented. It was clear that the people performing the ritual took them very seriously and that they were an integral part of their practice, but for us, they were nothing more than mysterious etchings on the trees and rocks. At the time, we certainly noticed them and thought they were odd, but we didn't pay them much attention. We were too busy enjoying the beauty of nature around us, and the symbols seemed like just another part of the scenery. It wasn't until we heard the chanting that we realized something was wrong. Intrigued and curious, we followed the sound, hoping to see what was going on. But we certainly didn't expect to find a group of people dressed in black robes, performing a ritual around a large fire. It was like something straight out of a movie. The chanting grew louder and more intense, but we couldn't make out the words. The cultists, around 20 in number, were all clad in black robes, some with peculiar symbols painted on their faces and others donning eerie masks. They encircled a towering bonfire, the flames leaping high into the night sky, casting a flickering orange glow across their sinister faces. In front of the fire stood an altar, adorned with flickering candles and other peculiar objects. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I watched in disbelief as one of the cultists produced a white rabbit and proceeded to sacrifice it on the altar. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and one of the cultists approached the fire with a small wooden box from within his robe. He opened it, revealing a vial containing an unknown substance, which he carefully dripped onto the flames. Suddenly, my eyes were drawn to a figure on a table near the altar. A woman, her body painted with intricate designs, lay still with her eyes closed, breathing gently as if in a deep slumber. The cultists around the fire were swaying in unison, holding candles aloft as if entranced by some dark magic. As the chanting grew louder still, the woman on the table began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, and she sat up, looking around with a vacant expression. The cultists began to approach her, their faces twisted in ecstasy, as if they were under some kind of spell. All of a sudden, the woman let out a piercing scream and fell back onto the table, her body writhing in agony. The cultists dispersed, their faces now twisted in frustration and disappointment, as if the ritual had somehow failed. As they wandered around in confusion, one of them spotted us, and the rest of the cultists turned their attention towards us. They looked angry, as if they blamed us for interrupting their ceremony. I could feel their menacing stares as they began to approach us, their black robes billowing in the wind. We ran as fast as we could, but they were always right behind us. "I don't think we can outrun them," Emily gasped. "We need to find somewhere to hide." I nodded in agreement and scanned our surroundings frantically. That's when we spotted an old cabin up ahead. We ran inside and slammed the door shut, hoping it would hold. We could hear the cultists pounding on the door, and we knew it was only a matter of time before they broke through. We searched the cabin for any weapons we could find, and that's when we found an old axe. We knew it wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. We huddled together, ready to defend ourselves, when suddenly we heard yelling outside, followed by the sound of wolves howling close by. It was an eerie sound that sent chills down our spines. We didn't know if it was a good or negative sign, but at least the cultists had stopped pounding on the door. We were terrified, but we finally mustered the courage to peek outside. To our shock, the cultists were gone and there was no sign of them. It was like they had vanished into thin air. We stayed in the cabin a few hours until we decided to make a run for it back to our car. We knew it was a risk, but we couldn't stay in the cabin forever. We opened the door cautiously, ready to bolt if we saw any sign of the cultists. We ran as fast as we could through the woods. We kept moving, trying to stay on the path we had taken earlier. We didn't know how long we had been running, but our legs were starting to feel like jelly. We kept running, the dense forest started to thin out, and we could see a clearing up ahead. Just as we thought we had made it, we saw them. Two cultists emerged from the tree line, their eyes fixated on us like predators. The sight of their black robes and masks made my blood run cold. They had long, sharp knives in their hands, glinting menacingly in the dappled sunlight. We skidded to a stop, our hearts racing in our chests. But just as they were about to close in on us, we heard a gunshot ring out. The cultists paused for a moment, startled, and we took the opportunity to run past them. As we looked back, we saw a figure emerge from a cabin atop a hill. The cabin was surrounded by a cleared radius of trees, presumably to prevent wildfires. The figure was dressed in a ranger's uniform, holding a gun in their hand. They shouted out a warning to the cultists, who seemed to think better of pursuing us any further. We kept running until we were sure we were out of danger. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for air and shaking with fear. We explained everything to the ranger, and he quickly called for backup. The police took our statements, and we led them back to the cabin where we had taken refuge. The officers searched the area, but they found no trace of the cultists. They told us that they would continue their investigation and that we should go home and stay safe. Emily and I got into our car, still trembling from the adrenaline and fear. We drove back to our homes, grateful to be alive but still shaken by what had happened. Over the next few days, we followed the news closely, hoping for any updates on the cult and their whereabouts. But there was no news, and the incident seemed to have been forgotten. Months passed, and Emily and I tried to move on from the terrifying experience. But every time we went into the woods or heard a strange noise, we couldn't help but remember that night. One day, we both received a letter in the mail. It was a handwritten note, with no return address. I opened it cautiously, unsure of what to expect. The letter read, "We know what you saw, and we know what you heard. But you should know that you are not safe. We are always watching, and we will come for you." Emily and I were terrified once again, and we immediately called the police. They assured us that they would investigate and take the letter as evidence material. However, we knew that the handwriting couldn't be recognized as belonging to any specific person since it appeared to be deliberately messy and inconsistent, almost as if the author had written it with their non-dominant hand. We hoped that the police would be able to catch the person responsible, but we knew that it would be difficult with such little evidence. We knew that we couldn't rely on the police alone. We started taking self-defense classes and installed security cameras around our homes. We never went into the woods again and always carried some form of protection with us. One becomes paranoid after such an experience, especially after receiving that letter. It felt like people were following me. Strange individuals who just stood and stared. But whether it was just my imagination, I'm not sure. Years passed, and we never heard from the cult again, but we couldn't help but wonder if one or more of the cultists knew us. They must have obtained our addresses from somewhere, and it made us feel uneasy. After receiving multiple reports of strange noises and suspicious activity in the woods, the police and rangers collaborated to increase patrols in the area. This led to the arrest of 3 individuals who were suspected of being involved in illegal activities such as drug trafficking and animal cruelty. During the raid, the police found evidence of animal remains and drug paraphernalia, which confirmed their suspicions about the involvement of these individuals in criminal activities. They were charged with multiple offenses, including animal cruelty, drug trafficking, and conspiracy to commit illegal acts. Despite the best efforts of the police and other authorities, the investigation into the strange incidents in the woods and those involving us continued for several months. However, the investigation was eventually closed, as they were unable to find any concrete evidence linking the arrested to these incidents. The strange incidents in the woods stopped, but the fact that most of the cultists were still free and at large left many questions unanswered and was unsettling. It was unclear if they had disbanded or if they were continuing their activities elsewhere. The police remained vigilant and continued to monitor the area, but there were no further reports of suspicious activity or strange occurrences. The incident remained a mystery, and the true intentions of the cultists as well as the full extent of their activities were unknown. It was a sobering reminder that there were still groups out there operating in secrecy and that we may never know the full extent of their actions. From what was discovered, it appeared that the group was attempting to summon some sort of spiritual entity or deity, using various objects such as candles, incense, and herbs. It was speculated that the cultists may have been practicing some form of neo-pagan or occult religion, though this was never confirmed. Some of the objects found at the site suggested a connection to ancient religions or mythologies, though it was unclear if these were authentic artifacts or simply replicas. Overall, the specifics of the ritual remained a mystery, as the arrested individuals denied any involvement and refused to divulge any information about their activities. Looking back, I still can't believe that I had never heard of the cult before. It's scary to think that such a dangerous group could be operating right under our noses without anyone knowing. As much as I wanted to forget that night, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the fortunate events that allowed us to escape unharmed, despite the potential danger we faced that night. The thought of what might have happened if the cultists had managed to enter the cabin still sends shivers down my spine. And then the ranger showed up just in time to save us from the 2 others. If it weren't for these fortunate events, who knows what could have happened to us. It was as if fate had intervened to protect us from harm or as some higher power was looking out for us that night. We later learned about superstitions surrounding the woods we were in, strange happenings, and unusual occurrences in these parts. Some even believed that the forest was cursed and that those who entered were doomed to suffer misfortune. Perhaps the cultists themselves were aware of these superstitions and feared what might happen if they continued their pursuit. Maybe they had some superstition around the cabin. Or maybe they had encountered something even more terrifying than they had bargained for. Wolves don't normally attack people, let alone a group of 20 armed individuals. So why should the cultists be scared? As for the wolves, it's possible that their howling had some significance in the local folklore and the cultists were wary of disturbing them. It's also possible that the wolves simply acted as a deterrent, scaring off the cultists with their pack mentality and aggressive behavior. Perhaps it was the sheer number of wolves that made the cultists back off, or maybe it was the unexpectedness of the situation. As for the yelling, it could have been a disagreement between the cultists themselves. The weird part is that the cultists didn't come back to the cabin. We waited anxiously for a while, wondering if they would return, but they never did. And then, the next day, we encountered 2 cultists in broad daylight. It didn't seem like they had been running, and they were coming from the opposite direction of where we had fled. We hadn't seen anyone following us, and we had run so fast that it seemed unlikely that they could have caught up to us. It was a strange and unsettling experience that left us with more questions than answers, and the mystery surrounding the events only added to the eerie atmosphere of the forest. But one thing was certain, we had survived an encounter that could have easily ended in tragedy, and for that, we were fortunate. I don't hike anymore. The thought of being out in the woods and encountering the unknown was no longer thrilling but terrifying. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of being followed. What did the cultists want from us? Did someone know us? Was the letter only meant to scare us? Are we still in danger? These questions still haunt me to this day. As time passed, we went back to our normal lives and eventually moved out of the area. That night in the woods was a wake-up call for me, a reminder to always stay vigilant, aware, and never underestimate the dangers that could be lurking. Who knows what other dangers are out there, waiting to be discovered.